Thanks for coming. I have some of my students are here, and as you guys know, I like to move around a lot, so I'm gonna get the prop out of the way. I'm thrilled to be here for many different reasons. Thrilled to be invited to talk about the work that I love, and also I finished teaching today, and I'm thrilled to do that. I love my students, you guys know that, but it's good. It's good to have a break. So, and I also like to talk about Hawaii when there's snow on the ground because it's kind of odd and weird and exciting. So, without further ado, also, I'm not going to talk a lot about myself because I don't want to waste my time talking about who I am and my resume, which is a very strange and long story of professional experiences that I've had all over the place. I'll tell you simply that I came to Hawaii in 2001, and we moved to Keene in 2007. But I continue to work in the Hawaiian Islands doing anthropology, archaeology, historical studies, forensic anthropology, even today. So 23, going on 24 years of a professional experience in the islands. Before I go further, how many Hawaiians are in the room tonight? Just raise your hand. How many people have been to Hawaii? My wife almost raised her hand. Okay, excellent. Your last name looks very Hawaiian. It does. So remember, I asked you that a long time ago. So I'm not Hawaiian. My two children were born and raised in Hawaii. So they have a special relationship with the land. And they are known in the islands as Kama'aina, which means children of the land, essentially. And I was born and raised somewhere else, near Boston. So I'm a child of Boston, but there we go. Okay, see if I can figure that thing out. Oh boy. All right. Okay. My students will also know I'm very low tech, so thank you very much. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do tonight is to combine some interesting information from two entire 15-week courses that I teach at Keene State. One is forensic anthropology. The other is people and cultures of Hawaii. Forensic anthropology is essentially a group of methods or techniques that we can use, scientific techniques, to ask and answer interesting questions. The interesting questions that I will be talking about tonight are: how has the treatment of human remains and burials in Hawaii changed over time? And I'll show you some slides to show you what I call several phases of the treatment of human remains and burials in Hawaii, how they've changed essentially from a long time ago, let's say from curiosities in the 19th century to today, powerful political tools and related to Hawaiian independence movements, Hawaiian sovereignty. So that's a long way to go in the talk that I'm giving. And in a few instances, I'm going to take a real hard turn, a left turn or a right turn, a transition between talking about the science, talking about Hawaiian history, and I'll do my best to make it all work for you guys. One of the things that we will talk about tonight are a series of cultural icons, even heroes, they might be called, in Hawaiian history and in contemporary Hawaii. Here's one of them. This is Israel Kamakawiwa Ole. Thankfully for you, you can call him Brada Is. It took me many years to learn how to say Kamakawiwa Ole. A giant in Hawaii, passed away prematurely. He's best known out of Hawaii as the guy who put together the two songs. He's a singer and an ukulele player, entertainer, putting together into a medley Somewhere Over the Rainbow and help me, What a Wonderful World, right? In Hawaii, in addition to being a musician, he was a fierce proponent of Hawaiian rights and indigenous rights. His most famous album is called Facing Future. And when I teach this course, the first thing that we do, when I have the opportunity to teach it every other year, probably now, is we actually listen to him sing a famous song. And for some of my students, it seems a little weird to them. Because when you get into Hawaii and you try to learn about what's really at the core of Hawaii, comes from the heart. We don't talk about that very much because we live in a different world than that. This guy spoke from the heart about hope, about the future of the Hawaiian people. And he is duly revered for that in the islands to this day. Other cultural icons of importance, when we talk about things like Hawaiian cultural renaissance movements, I'll tell you in here tonight that there are 3 different times in Hawaiian history where Hawaiians experienced a movement forward, and we call it a cultural renaissance. This man is largely responsible for the first one in the late 19th century, King David Kalakaua. King David Kalakaua was the last king of the Kingdom of Hawaii, the last male monarch, and he was largely responsible for saving the practice of hula, which had been essentially outlawed at the beginning of the 19th century by missionaries and other Western powers, essentially. He is revered in Hawaii by hula practitioners because without the actions of the King David, the Merry Monarch in the 1880s, hula would have been suppressed and lost to history. And it's a lot more than dancing. Hula is a spiritual, religious, philosophical lifestyle, essentially. Very intense. And hula is near and dear to the hearts of all Hawaiians. Yet another cultural icon that we'll talk about tonight, a very important part of the story, is the last reigning monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani. People in Hawaii, that's another mouthful, call her the Queen or Lili, Queen Lili. Liliuokalani reigned for a couple of years and was deposed in a coup d'etat in 1893 by US business interests backed by the United States military. So here's one of our taking a big transition and a big turn. And we can talk real quickly about what is forensic anthropology. I decided I'm gonna switch the order of these slides. Very, very, very simply, without getting into too many technical details, forensic anthropology is a set of methods for analyzing human skeletal remains. When I say that, I mean all of the bony material, including the teeth from head to toe, to answer different kinds of questions. Forensic anthropology began mostly as a way to address the first kinds of case studies, criminal or legal, but it can also, as a set of methods and techniques, can be used to address historical issues, archaeological issues, even paleontological. So I like to think of forensic anthropology as a set of methods, scientific techniques that can be brought to bear when you're studying human skeletal remains to help you answer unanswered questions. The word forensic just means techniques to help with legal or criminal questions. So you may have heard before the terms like forensic audit or forensic accounting. Forensic anthropology is just a way to study remains and answer and ask interesting questions about criminal stuff, historical, archaeologically. You may ask a question. What do we need anthropologists for? Don't they have enough stuff to do? What's so hard about identifying human skeletal remains? If they look like this, not so hard. If you take a few intro biology course, a couple of human osteology classes, there's only 206 of the bones. You can memorize the names and the shapes, and you can understand all that. For the most part, however, we're not dealing with this. We're dealing with things like this, and this is where anthropologists come in, and archaeologists, who are anthropologists. It's a subspecialty of anthropology. Archaeologists have specialized information, knowledge, skills, and abilities that can be brought to bear on much more difficult to study collections of remains than looking at something like this. So in the class that I teach on forensics, we start with this, of course, and we ultimately try to get to identifying and interpreting things like this and this. Here's a woman, unfortunately, where her baby and she died when she was in childbirth. You can see the fetal remains right there. So what are these specialized knowledge, skills, and abilities that archaeologists and anthropologists bring to bear on the analysis of human skeletal remains? Again, more than a medical doctor, more than someone who's an expert at studying osteology, we, because I'm an archaeologist, we're very good at surveying, documenting what we find, mapping things in 3 dimensions. We're very meticulous about creating a systematic system for mapping, showing where stuff came from, recording it, so later we can reconstruct it in 3 dimensions, for example. There's a famous archaeologist, American archaeologist, and one of the things he said, he had a lot of interesting quips. He said archaeology is the only field where we kill our informants, meaning the very information that we need to study, by doing it and recovering it and taking out of the ground, we destroy the evidence. So archaeologists are very good at recording and documenting that evidence as we remove it from the ground. So we're good at 3-dimensional mapping. We're good at recording the condition, orientation, and arrangement of the human skeletal remains, because that can be very important. What parts are present, what parts are not? Are the bones articulated? Are they jumbled? Are they arranged in a pattern? Archaeologists are good at interpreting soils and stratigraphy, so that's the ordered layers of sediment and soil underneath the ground from which the material may derive, collecting information that might tell us something about the environment of burial. We're also skilled at dating techniques. So that's trying to get to the age of a burial event, when the remains went into the ground, what happened to them in the interim period between when they were buried and when we discover them, or when someone else discovered them. All the while doing it in such a way that we don't contaminate the evidence, essentially, that we don't contaminate the samples, the human skeletal remains. So we could talk a long time about this kind of information, but we're going to kind of move forward tonight and go quickly. This is a very typical kind of a forensic anthropological assignment, or an example of something that forensic anthropologists are faced with on a regular basis, and that is someone found a bag of bones somewhere, or a box of bones, or bones in a weird place, or in a basement. And as a forensic anthropologist, I can look at this right now and tell you a whole lot of things about it without even working on the material, just from looking at it. When I teach forensic anthropology, we look at a lot of these things in class with my students, and we try to make some interpretations about what we're looking at. So I can tell you roughly how old this person is and a few other things. So that's what, forensic anthropologists are good at doing that, even when bones are fractured, fragmentary, in poor condition, like cremated human remains or cremains. You don't really get trained to do this when you go to medical school if you take a course in human osteology or biology. So it's another kind of thing that archaeologists and anthropologists are used to dealing with. And that's material that's been through a lot. And what our job is to try to interpret what happened to those bones. How did they get like this? In addition to how many people are there and anything else that we can tell about those people. We're really good at identifying artifacts. So here's a spear point buried in the shoulder of someone. A skilled archaeologist can tell you not only that that's a spear point and probably the cause of death of this person, they can probably tell you what archaeological culture and time period that particular spear point comes from. So again, that's one of the reasons why anthropologists have a special role in studying human skeletal remains, what we call forensic anthropology. Especially for legal and criminal cases, when given a set of bones, we're usually asked these basic questions. Who is the person? And who is the person is a series of how old are they? What's their biological sex? Can you tell me anything about their stature, how big they were, how small they were? If we're lucky, ancestry, maybe where their family comes from in the world, geographic ancestry, what we used to call race, but we don't really do that anymore. When did they die? And how did they die? So the study of trauma, pathology on human skeletal remains can tell us something about what maybe they had a disease or maybe they died an accidental death, for example. These are the basic questions of forensic anthro. There are boatloads of data sets that we can work with that can help us understand, for example, the age of immature individuals based on knowledge of how teeth appear, erupt, how they change from baby teeth to permanent teeth. This is one data set. There are dozens or hundreds. We can apply knowledge of the biology of bones and how they fuse together over the course of someone's lifetime to tell how old, especially in the teenage years up to about 30 years of age, we can tell with some accuracy, plus or minus a couple few years, how old someone is based simply on which of their bones are fully fused and which are not. So again, forensic anthropological methods. And we spent 15 weeks talking about this, so you can see I'm sort of in a hurry. But we spend a lot of time looking at alterations and modifications to individual bones because they tell us different kinds of information. We generally divide these kinds of observations into three types of modifications, alterations to bones. Ante-mortem observations are things that tell us about how that person lived. So if I broke a bone in my body and it healed, and then I went on to live for decades, you'd be able to see that later in life, that I had a bone break and I had it successfully set and healed. That's an example of an ante-mortem observation. Peri-mortem tells us about the cause of death. Like that example I showed you with that person with a spear point buried in his or her shoulder. Post-mortem observations are things that happen long after the death event. They generally tell us about the environment of the burial, what happened to it, maybe decades, hundreds, thousands of years after death, and between when we recovered it and were able to study it. There's all sorts of things that happen to bones, as simple as bone weathering and alteration to the surfaces of them. We're always trying to decide which of these three that we're looking at, because it helps us answer different questions. Here's a healed blunt force trauma to someone's forehead. Ante-mortem modification. If this was the cause of death, that wound would look very fresh. Even if it was old, it would look really different. This has remodeled, the bone has come back. This person didn't have a great reset of this injury, but they lived for a long time after that accident. Here's an example of a cause of death modification, perimortem, an exit wound from a bullet. You can see how fresh things look. Right here, right there. Okay. Really good example of post-mortem alteration to bones that tell us something about the environment in which the bones were deposited. This is classic root etching. So like being buried under grass, being buried under something with little rootlets. Looks just like this. Through experimentation over the years, forensic anthropologists have figured out how to identify this. This can tell you something. If someone brings a set of bones to you and they tell you that they've been in their trunk the whole time, and you see something like this, you know the answer is not complete. There's something else going on. And so that's, again, the work of forensic anthropologists. Whew, we finally made it back to Hawaii. Okay. I wanted to give my whole talk on Hawaii, and the folks here were like, can you talk about forensic anthropology a little bit? And I'm like, yeah, let's do it. We can do it. Okay, so at the beginning, I told you that burials, human skeletal remains in Hawaii have gone through kind of an evolution of treatment, of being considered first as curiosities, scientific curiosities, like a lot of things in the 18th century, old National Geographic kind of stuff, isn't it exotic? Until professional archaeology around World War II in that time in Hawaii, middle 20th century, actually did a lot of really good groundbreaking work where the burial practices of ancient Hawaiians, some of them were understood, were discovered in excavation and surveys, very important foundational work to help us understand what Hawaiians did with their dead. Examples of some spectacular things in Hawaii that are things such as canoe burials. Canoe burials going up into the mountains, the tops of the mountains, and going into caves and rock shelters and finding an entire actual canoe with one person buried in it. Those people and those canoe burial examples are extremely rare. And those were the chiefs. Those were the high chiefs. In Hawaii, we call them the ali'i. Some were treated in that way. Regular people, commoners, not at all. But this period of professional archaeology laid the groundwork for helping us understand variation and those kinds of cultural practices. Starting in the 1970s or maybe the 1960s, a national trend in the field, one of its names is called the New Archaeology, was to get a little bit more systematic about why we're even doing archaeology. And so people archaeologists and forensic anthropologists in Hawaii started trying to study whole populations or samples of skeletons to get to things like paleopathology, how healthy were Hawaiians back in the day, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. What did they look like? Did they look like other Polynesians? Basic questions about paleodemography, paleo health. Even things like trauma and pathology, like we talked about before. And by the 90s, a whole bunch of things happened in Hawaii, and I'll be telling you about some of these case studies, where new laws were finally passed, again, reflecting a trend in federal law and a change in the legal treatment of how burials are handled. Who gets to say what happens to them? And that's the first time that human skeletal remains and burials moved from an archaeological entity, like cool scientific data to look at, to something else. And that is the ancestors of the modern Hawaiians. And that's been a big change in the islands. So I won't talk a lot about it, but one of the things that I can't do in here and I won't do in here is show you photographs of Hawaiian remains, because it's against the law in Hawaii. And it's based on these laws that were passed in the 90s. And so we respect that. All right. back to the Queen. The Queen is my reminder that we're going back and we're going to do a little bit of history here. So most people don't know this, and they haven't heard the story that in the 1800s, Hawaii was organized as a kingdom. It was actually a constitutional monarchy by the time of the overthrow in 1893. The essential, the most important figure, royal figure, the king who unified the Hawaiian Islands in the early 1800s was Kamehameha the First, or Kamehameha the Great. And he passed away in 1819. The missionaries showed up in 1820. It's a very interesting story and very interesting timing. After the missionaries, all sorts of people started getting interested in coming to Hawaii, economic development. Essentially, what you might consider to be colonialism is how it was playing out. And by the 1890s, the Queen in 1893 was overthrown by some US businessmen who were growing sugarcane and later pineapple. The leader of this group was Sanford Dole Pineapple. And the Queen only reigned for a couple of years. One thing that I like to stress and talk about with my students over and over again is that this is not ancient history. We're not talking about 5,000 years ago, talking about 1893. And it's important for us as anthropologists, historians, regular educated Americans to understand that Hawaii, some Hawaiians, they don't consider that they were overthrown. They consider to this day that they are occupied illegally. So I mean that's part of the vibe. You can go to Honolulu today and see the Iolani Palace, the only royal palace in the United States. I heard a piece of trivia some time ago that it was also wired for electricity in the 1840s, like first place in America, but I'm not exactly sure of yeah, okay. I get a thumbs up from my wife who knows these things too. Here are the Marines lined up in front of I keep doing that. Lined up in front of Iolani Palace here, formalizing or backing this businessman-led coup, bloodless coup, of the Queen. The Queen was very smart, and the Hawaiians were very smart. The Hawaiians essentially are extremely peace-loving people. They didn't put up any military opposition to a fight that they knew that they would not win. So they had seen Europeans and Americans hanging around the islands for 100 years. They saw the firepower that they had, all of the incredible technology that they had. And so they did not make an effort to actually fight. So that's why we call it a bloodless coup. The Queen, until the day she died during World War I, was a tireless fighter to get her kingdom back. She took many trips to Washington, D.C. She talked to all the senators and important people that she could think of to have this unjust action overturned. It never happened. So after the coup, 5 years later, the U.S. annexed the Hawaiian Islands, and then in 1900, it became the U.S. territory, and of course later a state. This is a very famous document. If you're not familiar with it, Hawaiians refer to this as the Apology Resolution, and it was in the early Bill Clinton days. The United States Congress issued this, and it basically lays out, if you've ever read lawyerly documents about facts and history, there's a lot of these whereas kind of statements, and it lays out the whole story of what all happened, and essentially on behalf of the United States apologizes to Hawaii for colonizing it and taking its land. Interesting part of this 4-page apology resolution is the very last line, written by a smart lawyer, says, "Nothing in this joint resolution is intended to serve as a settlement of any claims against the United States." So it's a statement of fact, but it's like, we're not going to do anything about it just yet. But this kinds of information is the stuff that today contemporary Hawaiians are still getting themselves organized, getting professional, becoming lawyers, becoming educated about these things. And there are a lot of people who would like this last line to change. They would like something to happen. Many people, quite frankly, would like to get their kingdom back. And so we'll see what happens about that. So let's talk about what I mentioned before, a series of what we might call cultural renaissance movements or renaissances. It's really awkward as a plural. Kalakaua, the King David Kalakaua brought the hula back. He did other things too. He literally brought surfing back. Imagine Hawaii without surfing. Hawaiians invented surfing. Mark Twain writes about going to Honolulu and watching King David Kalakaua surfing on a plank of wood. He did it so his people could do it, because it was another thing that was outlawed by the missionaries and the folks that came before. The second phase in the 1970s, the Hawaiian Renaissance, is really the most important to what we're talking about today, because it's directly related to changes in Hawaiians really getting their rights restored, really becoming in charge of their own destiny. So for various reasons that I'll explain to you. Some would argue that we are today in a third phase, a third cultural renaissance of Hawaiians getting their kingdom back, getting their independence back, more than just being proud of who they are, but actually taking action. Hawaiian language schools and the reconstitution of knowledge of Hawaiian culture and history and language is part of that story. The third phase, illustrated and exemplified by the recent protest against another telescope being built on the top of Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea Mountain, almost 14,000 feet. Not only the highest point in Hawaii, the highest point in all of Polynesia, and considered by many the home of the gods, essentially. And why not? Everybody knows Jason Momoa. He was up there helping out. The Rock was up there. Here's a giant, a cultural icon, a hero of the Hawaiian people, Walter Riddy. Him and others were arrested, protesting, putting another telescope on the top of Mauna Kea. Walter Riddy, instrumental in one of the most important movements of the 1970s in Hawaii, was to get the military to stop bombing, using as a bombing target the island of Kaho'olawe. Kaho'olawe is 10 miles away from Maui, and not that far away from Walter's home island of Molokai. Starting in World War II, Hawaiians are not against the military, by the way. Hawaiians were also there for Pearl Harbor. They supported America needing to train, needing to do military things. After a while, on the heels of the 1960s, again, reflecting social movements and elsewhere in the United States, by the 70s, Hawaiians were like, enough already. Could you please stop bombing on this island that's right next to all the rest of us and covering it with unexploded ordnance? So the guy I showed you before, Walter Riddy, with some others, literally put their lives on the line in the mid-1970s, and they took small boats out to Kaho'olawe, and they went out and they said, we're occupying the island, I dare you to bomb it. And this guy passed away. George Helm is famous in the Hawaiian Islands for standing up for Hawaiian rights. He disappeared on one of these trips in the ocean, and nobody knows exactly what happened. So it took until 1991 to get the military to stop doing it. But the roots of that movement are in this second cultural renaissance in the 1970s. One more example, and we could talk about 10. Very, very famous story of Hokulea. That is the reconstruction of an actual Hawaiian long-distance sailing vessel by Hawaiians and others in the 1970s, learning how to do this technology that had been lost, sailing all the way to Tahiti, over 2,000 miles. I think it took them about 35 days. without modern instruments. No compass, no sextant, no whatever people use. Today it's all, all you need is a Garmin, right? But in the 1970s, you could have had a series of tools that helped you do that. These guys figured out how to do it the old traditional way. And it wasn't easy. It took years for them to do it. The successful result of that was an incredible expansion of pride and belief by the Hawaiians in their own abilities, in their own greatness. There are petroglyphs that show sailing vessels from the ancient times in Hawaii. Another giant cultural icon, if you will, Nainoa Thompson. He was there. He was a very young man. He sailed on the original vessels. He eventually became the captain. He learned how to do these ancient techniques of sailing with the stars, essentially, understanding the currents, what the sun and the moon and all that stuff is doing, just like his ancestors did. He is now the spokesperson for Hokulea, which travels all around the world on missions of peace and education. An amazing man who some of us in this room have had a chance to at least say hello to, if not meet. One of the humblest people you'll ever meet. That's Hawaiian. The whole Hokulea thing was started by a series of guys that are incredibly important. I wish I could talk more about them. They formed something called the Polynesian Voyaging Society. They did all this research. They figured out how to build the boat. They didn't know if it was going to work. They figured out how to navigate, do all sorts of things that eventually, several years later, before the 70s were out, they were successful. Someone died in the effort. They capsized their first try. So it was serious business when it happened. And when they were successful, Hawaii rejoiced. Very, very important. This too is part of that 1970s movement, which we call the second cultural renaissance. Okay, so series of lasting legacies as a result of this second Hawaiian Renaissance. By 1978, the Hawaiian Constitution was completely rewritten and it put Hawaiian rights at the top. It's an amazing document that the state still is under. The 1978 state constitution gave all sorts of rights to Native Hawaiians. Hokulea was part of that. However, unfinished business. Burials were still left as sort of scientific data. They weren't really as protected as they are now. And that's been part of the process and part of what we'll talk about as we go further here and finish up. Some comments on Hawaiian burial practices. First of all, the chiefs and the commoners were treated differently, and that shouldn't be surprising. They were buried in different ways. Hawaiians did not bury people in cemeteries, no headstones, no grave markers. Average Hawaiians, they knew where all the burials were, but they didn't write it down and they didn't tell anyone else about it because it was secret information. It's considered rude to talk about something like that. So that's how it was back in the day. In traditional times, people who lived in a particular valley, I cruise through this because of another traditional concept of land division in Hawaii. People would belong to one of these, almost like serfdom. They would belong to a certain land division called ahupa. They knew where their people were. They knew where their ancestors were, but they didn't write it down. They didn't mark it out. Chiefs were in completely different places. So chiefs were in faraway, remote places. Knowledge of that, going near those areas was completely tapu or taboo. Commoner burial sites were right near other parts of the landscape. As an archaeologist, I've had the opportunity to discover, document, preserve burials in all sorts of different contexts, like sand dunes, where most of the commoners are buried, in other places like cliffs and caves. There's a great variety of burial practices in Hawaii. Here's an example of a site where this is This is natural rock face, like a cave opening. There's the other side of it. All in here, you can see it's artificially stuffed or jammed with stacked rocks. If your eyes are really good, you can see. Intentionally blocked. There's burials inside there. So in a project area like this, we found that the whole place was filled up with this. So we got the developer to just preserve the whole area and leave it alone. That's part of our work. We don't need to go in and examine everything and pick all the bones apart. We can try to save and preserve them because that's what the Hawaiians have asked us to do. So sharing the location of burials has been a cultural taboo forever amongst Hawaiians. It's not the kind of information that you talk about with other people, and it's frankly considered rude to poke into someone's backyard and, hey, we're the archaeologists, show us your burials. I mean, that's the kind of sort of the conflict between science archaeology and the Hawaiian culture. So there's always been a level of secrecy about it. A lot of the oral information was lost in the 19th century. 19th century was a very difficult time for Hawaiians, Hawaiian culture. They suffered a lot. Okay, so prior to the 70s, developers, archaeologists, people who were essentially in charge and had power, mostly the museums, the universities, and the military, they kind of sort of did whatever they wanted to do with burials and human remains. They were considered archaeological data, essentially. And the archaeologists, almost none of them were from Hawaii or Hawaiian. So they're people from somewhere else, essentially. That's the old way. Some case studies of burial desecration that happened over time. Famous one is the Mokapu, the Marine Corps base in Kaneohe on the east coast or the windward side of Oahu. If you want to read more about it, you can check out that link. Here's the location. Here's Oahu. Here's Mokapu. And here is the burial area up here, sand dunes. Very typical place for commoners to be buried. World War II time, the military needed places to train and do their thing. And they started clearing this area. 1,600 sets of ancestral Native Hawaiians were bulldozed into piles, excavated, removed. And that case is still not resolved. Those people are still in boxes at the museum. It's a sore spot, one of the big outstanding sore spots with burials in Hawaii, even to this day. In the 70s, again, reflecting national trends, Hawaii finally got some a historic preservation department with professionals and archaeologists hired, but still there were no formal rules for how to deal with human remains. They're still just considered archaeology, essentially. In the 1980s, this changed when a big giant hotel was being put in on the north coast of Maui, a Ritz-Carlton, famous example that's in the law books. 1,200 sets of human remains were uncovered and were in the process of being documented by archaeologists and removed. The Hawaiians in 1988 rose up, protested against it, grassroots movement. The state eventually condemned the land. They moved the hotel back. The hotel's still there. There's a golf course there. They play a PGA event at Kapalua. But they took out they left them in place, 1,200 sets of, they had to put them back, restore the area. But this got Hawaiians extremely organized, essentially. And by '88 was the formation of a group that still exists today in Hawaiian, that name, Hui Malama Na Kupuna o Hawaiine, is basically the group that takes care of the ancient ones all throughout Hawaii. Hui Malama started by some Hawaiian lawyers and some other activists, helped write burial rules in Hawaii. So they finally got, in the 1990s, rules to separate human skeletal remains and burials from being just strictly archaeological data, essentially. Other things happened. that continue to this day. And that one of them is the beginning of these things called island burial councils. So when I go out and find some burials as an archaeologist, I have to go consult with Native Hawaiians and say, here's what we found, what do you think we should do? So it's a legal administrative process that didn't exist before. There are burial interment areas and reinterment, reburial sites all over the islands. Here's one in a town that we used to live in. They wanted to put a Target store in the back there, and they did. And we said, when you go dig that parking lot, you're going to find bodies and remains. And they were like, okay, well, and it happened. And they didn't find so many. Sometimes you find hundreds, and it's a problem. There were literally 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 Hawaiian burials discovered in this parking lot. And there's a couple of these on the property. It's a tiny little reburial crypt. And these, you can see these all over the place. So a little mortared stone wall, nice little wrought iron fence and some plants. And there are some people that have been moved from a construction site into this reburial place. There are Hawaiians who come and take care of this, and they take care of the plants. They keep it free from garbage and rubbish and things like that. For your information, Waikiki, the playground of 50% of tourists that come to the Hawaiian Islands, is a giant burial ground. Hundreds of sets of remains of old Hawaiian burials have been removed, disturbed by hotel construction and redevelopment and all sorts of things. And they have been put in this reburial crypt that we started out, that's on the one of the first slides here. Really big, because there's a lot of folks in there, and it can be opened and other remains can be put in as they are discovered. I'm getting close to being out of time, but I'm almost there. So all of this stuff comes out of the activism of Native Hawaiians demanding a say, and the primary say really, in what happens to human remains when they're discovered in the islands. Back to Brother Is. Facing Future, the name of his most famous album. Today, the care and treatment of human skeletal remains in the islands is an integral part of Hawaiian independence movements and political action. If people try to do things like developments that are upsetting to Hawaiians, they always now can at least say, hey, wait, we think there might be burials there. And they're usually right. And so even on the top of Mauna Kea, there are some structures that are burials of really important people. And so that's part of the equation now. And it's a good thing. And this is not new. So there has been attempts through time, not just today, to resist. The most famous, to resist occupation, colonialism, whatever you want to call it. The most famous are a series of, they're called coup petitions in 1897, all around the islands when the United States was getting ready to annex Hawaii and eventually make it a territory. All sorts of local people, Kama'aina, people born in the islands, Native Hawaiians, signed petitions, tens of thousands, to say, no, we don't want this. It did not work, and it didn't win the day, but it's part of the history, a long history that's not just 10 or 20 or 30 years old, but as long as the colonial efforts have been ongoing in Hawaii, some people have been resisting it, speaking out against it. We're back to Mauna Kea. We're back to where we are today, which is the fact of the matter is that over the course of the last maybe 20 years or so, multiple different kinds of efforts have gone forth where Native Hawaiians have attempted to get organized and to try to figure out what they actually want going forward. What kind of recognition do they want? They came very close some years ago to getting a recognition similar to Indians, Native Americans on the mainland, and that's to sort of have special federal recognition. The problem in Hawaii is you can't put people in certain areas and say, this is a reservation, this is the homeland. It's all Hawaii. They're all Hawaiians. And there have been other kinds of efforts, signature campaigns, to try to figure out what do Hawaiians want? Do they really want to be independent? Do they want a special relationship with the United States government? That's another lecture and very interesting topic for future discussion. And I think I've talked enough. Mahalo for listening. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions? Question. So you did mention that Native Hawaiians don't have the same protections as Native American Indians on the mainland. So does that mean NAGPRA doesn't apply to the remains of Native Hawaiians who are buried on the islands?
Only on federally owned land. So NAGPRA, the national burial, and yeah, only on federal lands, which is almost all military lands, and a handful of national parks. Yep.
So that means
Good question.
the remains that are found on private lands don't need to be returned.
They need to go through this process, which of the state process, which is even more. It's very strict, and like going before burial councils and such. So it's very similar. It's a different bureaucratic process. The protections are just as strong. Yep. Yep. And even on private land. So, which is unlike here. Like if you have private land in a lot of places, you can do whatever you want to do. If you're trying to put a swimming pool in Hawaii, you're going to need to get a permit, and someone's going to need to do at least an assessment to say, hey, this is a burial area. And they're everywhere because people have always lived in places that make sense to live in now, which is kind of the level areas, kind of near the coast. That's been going on for 1,000 years. So.
I noticed this one. No, it's okay. I noticed on the replica ship,
Yep.
the Hawaiian flag has the British flag included on it in the corner. Do we know why that's there?
It's a really good question. So the Union Jack is in like where our stars are. It's a little part of it, and there's a bunch of stripes. Yes, it's a very excellent question. So in 1843, for a very short time, a British ambassador took over Hawaii. He claimed Hawaii in 1843 for Britain. And then 7 or 8 months later, he got scolded for doing that unilaterally from the kings and queens of England. And Hawaii, for 7 months, at least on paper, was British. It was restored. So in Hawaii, there's something called Restoration Day. It's celebrating that event in 1843, where the British did the right thing. And so as a friendship, I guess, kind of a thing, they put part of their thing into the Hawaii state flag. So,
It's interesting.
yeah, it's interesting history.
It's like it belongs. It works.
For the Zoomies.
You mentioned difficulties repatriating human remains. So if you think about remains that would have been excavated or otherwise acquired 50, 60, 70 years ago, how successful have modern Hawaiians been at trying to get those remains either out of museums, university collections, or possibly private collections?
Yeah, the one example that I talked about from the Marine Corps base in Kaneohe, the famous example of something like 1,600 sets of remains that are still in limbo in the museum, the Bishop Museum. That's an outlier. For the most part, the repositories have been emptied, if you will, and it takes time. But a lot of people, goodwill people, both archaeologists and Hawaiians working for free or pro bono, have worked very hard to get those remains back to the people who can speak for them and usually reburied. So it actually works pretty well. Yeah, I have to say.
I have a follow-up question. In the United States, with NAGPRA, for example, sometimes one of the difficulties encountered by current indigenous tribes is trying to figure out whether or not the remains that are found are ancestral to them or to somebody else. So, as you're aware, occasionally, modern indigenous peoples can't agree on whose ancestors' remains they are.
Yep.
And then how to repatriate them or who they go to becomes a problem. Is there anything like that in Hawaii?
Yeah, it's a good question. So like a really good example of that is the Kennewick man in Washington, who's clearly over 9,000 years old. And the question, when you talk to the Umatilla folks or the people who were there, they're like, of course he's ours. But there are questions sometimes of, has this cultural group actually been in place for 9,000 years? Have they not moved around? Have they changed from one to another? In Hawaii, it's different for a couple reasons. Number one, all Hawaiians are Hawaiians, and roughly speaking, there aren't like divisions between where these kinds of Hawaiians and where those. It's sort of a very all-inclusive, we're all Hawaiians, right? The other thing is that the time depth is relatively short. So it's literally 1,000 years of time. We're not talking about 9,000, 15, whatever, it's 1,000. And we used to think Hawaii was founded about 2,000 years ago. There's been a lot of work, scientific work on the radiocarbon in a lot of it, and it just keeps saying the same thing, about 1,000 years. So there's usually, when we find burials, they're very rarely more than 300 or 400 or 500 years old. So everyone's pretty comfortable with the idea that these are Hawaiians, and they're not some other folks from somewhere else.
Thank you so much.
There's one more.
Oh,
Do Hawaiians seem to embrace archaeology as something that they value, or do they feel antagonistic or in opposition to?
More the latter. And there's a lot of mistrust even today. The vast majority of archaeology that's done in Hawaii has been done and still is contract archaeology in the service of developers and folks who need to get their permits and such. And Hawaiians have seen that for a really long time. The system is simple, is simply that the contract and the bills are paid by the project proponent and the developer. Very rarely, but sometimes, Hawaiians who own big chunks of land, and there are some wealthy Hawaiian organizations, sometimes they will have surveys done, and we're still hired to help them. And there's still a lot of distrust that archaeologists have ulterior motives, and generally it's to have a job and to make a living. And so, I've had many interactions where my ethics were questioned. And the irony of the whole thing is that archaeologists have probably found and saved and preserved more sites and shrines and burials than most people will ever see, even Hawaiians, in their lifetime, because we get around and we're asked to go all over the place. So, but the embrace has been very slow. Now there are a handful of PhD Hawaiians in archaeology, like literally 5, 6, 7 that I know. And even they get pushback. So it's never been great, a good relationship. We try to be really, really transparent and ethical because of that, which is a good thing.
hey, thank you so much. I just want to make a note that our forensics and genocide series will continue into the spring semester, and you can visit our website or sign up for our monthly newsletter for information about upcoming events. It's going to culminate in our genocide awareness lecture on April 2nd, so save that date. And finally, I want to say thank you to everyone who's on Zoom, in person, and especially thank you to Chris for this presentation tonight. I hope everyone gets home safe.